The morning fog clung to the city streets like a familiar embrace as Elara Matthews made her way to the Riverside Community Library. At 37, she had perfected the art of walking purposefully while remaining virtually invisible to the hurried commuters who brushed past her on the sidewalk. Her sensible shoes clicked against the pavement in a rhythm that had become as predictable as her breathing, steady, reliable, unremarkable. The library stood like a sanctuary amid the urban chaos, its weathered brick facade promising the quiet order that Elara craved. She unlocked the heavy oak doors and stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent of aged paper and polished wood that had become as essential to her as oxygen. The silence wrapped around her like a well-worn cardigan, comfortable and reassuring. Her days followed a pattern that had remained unchanged for nearly 8 years. She would arrive 15 minutes early, check the overnight book returns, organize the daily schedules, and ensure that every volume found its proper place on the shelves. The Dewey Decimal System was more than just a cataloging method to Elara. It was a philosophy that suggested everything in life could be organized, categorized, and made sense of if one simply applied the right principles. But as autumn deepened into November, even Elara's carefully ordered world couldn't shield her from the growing weight of resignation that settled in her chest like sediment. The reading program at the Riverside Community Center had been struggling for months, and despite her passionate volunteer work with the children every Tuesday and Thursday evening, she felt as though she were trying to hold back an ocean with her bare hands. "Miss Elara, will you read us another story about dragons?" 7-year-old Maya had asked just the week before, her dark eyes bright with anticipation. The community center's children's corner was cramped, with mismatched furniture and books that were falling apart at the seams, but to Maya and the dozen other children who showed up regularly, it was a magical place where stories came alive. Elara had smiled and reached for the tattered copy of The Reluctant Dragon, its spine held together with clear tape, knowing that each reading might be one of the last. The program had been on the chopping block for months, surviving on a shoestring budget that seemed to shrink with each passing quarter. She had submitted proposal after proposal to the city council, to local businesses, to anyone who might listen, but her requests seemed to disappear into the administrative void like messages in bottles cast into an indifferent sea. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, who spent her days surrounded by thousands of stories, felt as though her own narrative was barely worth a single page. She was the quiet librarian, the dependable volunteer, the woman who showed up consistently but never made waves. In a world that seemed to reward the loudest voices and the most dramatic gestures, Elara's steady presence felt increasingly insignificant. It was during one of these melancholy moments, as she reorganized the children's section for the 3rd time that week, that Martha Rodriguez, the community center director, approached her with an expression that was unusually difficult to read. "Elara, I wanted to talk to you about the annual fundraiser gala," Martha said, settling into one of the small plastic chairs that made her look like a giant in a dollhouse. "We're hoping you'll set up a display for the reading program." Elara nodded, already mentally preparing herself for another evening of polite conversations with well-meaning community members who would express sympathy for the program's plight but offer little in the way of concrete support. The gala had been running for 5 years, and each year the attendance seemed to dwindle, the donations growing smaller, the sense of futility more pronounced. "Of course," she replied, her voice carrying the practiced enthusiasm she had perfected for such occasions. "I'll put together something that highlights the children's achievements and the program's needs." Martha's smile seemed oddly mysterious, and for a moment, Elara caught something in her expression that looked almost like suppressed excitement. But before she could analyze it further, Martha was already standing, smoothing down her skirt with hands that seemed unusually fidgety. "Wonderful. And Elara? I really think this year's gala is going to be special. I have a feeling it might surprise all of us." The conversation left Elara with a vague sense of unease, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Martha had always been straightforward, sometimes brutally honest about the center's financial struggles and the uphill battle they faced in securing funding. This new optimism seemed out of character, almost forced, like an actor delivering lines they didn't quite believe. Over the following weeks, as Elara threw herself into preparing for the gala, She began to notice other small anomalies that felt like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. There was the new volunteer, David Chen, who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere with an enthusiasm for community work that bordered on the excessive. He was friendly enough, a soft-spoken man in his 40s who claimed to work in nonprofit consulting, but his questions about the reading program struck Elara as oddly specific. "How many children does the program serve exactly?" he had asked during one of his visits, pen poised over a notebook as if conducting an interview rather than making casual conversation. "About 15 to 20 regular attendees," Elara had replied, wondering why he needed such precise numbers for volunteer work. "And what would you say are the program's most pressing needs? If you had unlimited resources, what would you prioritize first?" The questions felt rehearsed, and when Elara began to elaborate on her vision for expanded programming and better resources, David scribbled notes with the intensity of a journalist on assignment. But whenever she tried to steer the conversation toward his background or his interest in the program, he would deflect with practiced ease, asking another question about curriculum development or space requirements. These interactions left Elara feeling unsettled, though she couldn't articulate why. David seemed genuinely committed to helping, and his questions suggested a level of engagement that was rare among casual volunteers. Perhaps she was simply amused to someone showing such detailed interest in her work. After years of feeling invisible, the attention felt both welcome and slightly overwhelming. As if to counterbalance any growing optimism, Elara received an email from the library administration about budget cuts that would affect community programming. The message was brief and bureaucratic, expressing regret about the necessity of reducing funding for outreach programs while emphasizing the administration's continued commitment to serving the community within fiscal constraints. Reading between the lines, Elara understood that her own position was secure, but any hopes of expanding the library's support for community initiatives were effectively dead. The email arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and Elara found herself staring at the screen long after she had finished reading, feeling the familiar weight of disappointment settle in her stomach. It seemed that everywhere she turned, the message was the same. Community programs were luxuries that couldn't be sustained, and the quiet work of nurturing young minds was expendable in the face of bottom-line realities. That evening, she walked to the community center through streets slick with early winter rain, her umbrella a black canopy against the harsh glow of streetlights. The children were already assembled in their corner when she arrived, Maya bouncing in her chair with the uncontainable energy of childhood excitement. "Miss Elara. Miss Elara. Tommy brought a book from home to show you." 8-year-old Tommy, usually shy to the point of near invisibility, stepped forward with a worn paperback clutched against his chest. The cover was barely hanging on, and the pages had the soft, flexible quality of a book that had been read countless times. "It's about a robot who learns to feel," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My mom says it was her favorite when she was little." Elara accepted the book with the reverence she reserved for the rarest manuscripts, turning it over in her hands and noting the careful way Tommy had handled it despite its fragile condition. This was what she was fighting for, not just literacy or academic achievement, but the moment when a child discovered that books could be treasures worth sharing, stories worth preserving and passing down. "Would you like to tell everyone about it, Tommy?" she asked gently. For the next hour, she watched as Tommy transformed from a quiet, hesitant child into an animated storyteller, his face glowing as he described his favorite scenes and characters. The other children listened with rapt attention, asking questions and sharing their own reading experiences with an enthusiasm that would have put most book clubs to shame. Walking home later that evening, Elara felt the familiar ache of loving something that seemed destined to disappear. She had submitted her most comprehensive proposal, yet, 3 months earlier, a detailed plan for expanding the reading program, complete with budget projections, curriculum outlines, and testimonials from parents and teachers. She had spent weeks crafting it, pouring her passion and expertise into every paragraph, but like all her previous efforts, it had vanished into the administrative ether without acknowledgement. The night before the gala, Elara lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling and listening to the city's nocturnal symphony of distant sirens and late-night traffic. She had prepared everything for her display with characteristic thoroughness. Photo collages showing the children engaged in various reading activities, charts demonstrating their progress, and carefully written descriptions of the program's goals and achievements. She knew the materials were compelling, but she also knew that compelling wasn't always enough. Her modest black dress hung on the bedroom door, pressed and ready for the evening ahead. It was the same dress she had worn to every formal occasion for the past 5 years, a simple sheath that was appropriate without being memorable. Like everything else in her life, it served its purpose quietly and without drawing attention. The morning of the gala dawned gray and drizzly, matching Elara's mood as she made her final preparations. She had arranged to arrive at the community center early to set up her display, hoping to have everything organized before the other volunteers and staff descended on the space in their pre-event frenzy. The community center's main hall had been transformed for the occasion, with round tables covered in white linens and a small stage decorated with strings of warm lights. It looked festive in a modest way, though Elara couldn't shake the feeling that the decorations were trying a bit too hard to create an atmosphere of celebration that might not be warranted by the actual attendance. She was arranging her photographs when the first crisis of the day struck. The projector she had planned to use for a brief presentation about the reading program emitted a concerning whirring sound, flickered twice, and then died with the finality of an old car giving up on a winter morning. "Oh, perfect," she muttered, examining the machine with the hopeless expression of someone who understood books far better than technology. Having trouble? David Chun appeared beside her, seemingly having materialized from thin air. He was dressed more formally than she had ever seen him, in a navy suit that looked expensive and well-tailored. "The projector decided to choose today to give up," Elara said, unable to keep the frustration from her voice. "I had prepared a short presentation, but I suppose I'll have to rely on the printed materials." David's expression showed what seemed like genuine concern, but there was something else there too, something that looked almost like satisfaction, as if the projector's failure was somehow expected or even desired. "I'm sure the display will be just as effective without it," he said, helping her move the dead projector to the side. Sometimes the personal touch is more powerful than technology anyway. As the afternoon progressed, Elara found herself dealing with a series of minor complications that seemed designed to keep her tethered to her display area. The keynote speaker was running late due to traffic, pushing back the program by half an hour. The caterers had questions about the setup that seemed to require Martha's input, but Martha was mysteriously unavailable, leaving Elara to make decisions about table arrangements and serving logistics that felt far outside her area of responsibility. It was during one of these moments, as she was attempting to mediate a dispute between the florist and the caterer about table space, that she overheard a fragment of conversation that made her pause. "Everything in place for her?" Martha's voice drifted from the hallway outside the main room, just loud enough to catch Elara's attention but too quiet to hear clearly. "The timing has to be perfect," came another voice that she thought might be David's. "She can't suspect anything beforehand." Elara strained to hear more, but the conversation had moved further away, leaving her with nothing but questions and a growing sense that something was happening around her that she didn't understand. She dismissed the feeling as pre-event paranoia, the kind of heightened awareness that came from being responsible for too many details in a situation where she felt out of her depth. By 6 o'clock, the hall was beginning to fill with attendees, and Elara was surprised to see that the crowd was larger than expected. Previous galas had attracted perhaps 30 or 40 people, mostly the same dedicated core of community supporters who showed up to everything out of obligation or genuine commitment. Tonight, she counted at least 60 people, with more still arriving. She positioned herself beside her reading program display, smoothing her dress and practicing the brief remarks she had prepared in case anyone showed serious interest in the program. The photographs of the children looked back at her from the display boards, Maya with her bright, curious eyes, Tommy clutching his beloved robot book, Sarah, who had started the program barely able to read her own name and now devoured chapter books with voracious appetite. Martha took the stage at 6:30, looking elegant in a midnight blue dress that Elara had never seen before. The community center director was usually a practical dresser, favoring comfortable clothes that could withstand the demands of managing children and community events. Tonight, she looked like she was attending a gala at the mayor's mansion rather than their small neighborhood fundraiser. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our annual community fundraiser, Martha began, her voice carrying clearly through the room without the microphone feedback that had plagued previous events. I want to thank each of you for being here tonight and for your continued support of our programs and services. Elara half listened to the opening remarks, her attention divided between Martha's speech and the faces in the crowd. She recognized many of the attendees, regular volunteers, local business owners, parents of children who participated in various center programs. But there were also unfamiliar faces scattered throughout the room, well-dressed people who carried themselves with the quiet confidence of individuals accustomed to philanthropic events. Before we enjoy dinner, Martha continued, I want to take a moment to talk about something very special that has happened here at the center. For the past several years, we've been privileged to host a children's reading program that has touched the lives of dozens of young people in our community. Elara's attention snapped back to the stage with sudden focus. Martha was looking directly at her, and the expression on the director's face was unlike anything Elara had seen before, warm, proud, and mysteriously excited. This program has been the passion project of one of our most dedicated volunteers, someone who has given countless hours of her time and energy to nurturing a love of reading in our children. Elara Matthews has been the heart and soul of this program, and tonight, I want to share some wonderful news about its future. The room seemed to shift around Elara, like a kaleidoscope suddenly turned. Faces were looking at her now, smiling faces that seemed to know something she didn't. Her heart began to beat faster, and she felt the familiar flush of anxiety that came from being the center of attention. Martha paused, her smile growing wider, and Elara noticed that David Chun had moved closer to the stage, his expression one of barely contained excitement. 3 months ago, Martha continued, Elara submitted a comprehensive proposal for expanding our reading program. What she didn't know was that this proposal found its way to the Riverside Foundation for Community Development, where it caught the attention of some very special people who believe in supporting grassroots initiatives that make a real difference in children's lives. The words seemed to be coming from very far away, filtered through the rushing sound of blood in Elara's ears. She gripped the edge of her display table, her knuckles white against the dark wood. Tonight, I have the incredible honor of announcing that the Riverside Foundation has awarded our reading program a 3-year grant of $150,000, with the possibility of renewal based on program outcomes. The room erupted in applause, but Elara heard it as if through water, muffled and distant. Numbers swirled in her head. $150,000, 3 years, renewable funding. It was more money than she had dared to dream of, enough to transform the reading program from a struggling afterthought into a robust educational initiative. But that's not all, Martha said, raising her hand to quiet the applause. The foundation was so impressed with Elara's vision and dedication that they've also approved funding for a dedicated reading space here at the center, complete with new furniture, an expanded library, and technology resources that will serve our community for years to come. David Chin stepped forward then, and suddenly his presence at the community center over the past weeks made perfect sense. He wasn't a volunteer at all. He was a representative of the foundation, conducting due diligence on their potential investment. Ms. Matthews, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room, I want to personally thank you for the passion and professionalism you brought to your proposal. In 15 years of working with community organizations, I've rarely seen such a compelling combination of practical planning and genuine love for the population being served. Elara felt tears beginning to blur her vision, and she realized that every person in the room was looking at her with expressions of warmth and appreciation. These weren't the polite, obligatory smiles she was accustomed to receiving at community events. These were faces lit with genuine celebration, people who seemed to understand the significance of what was happening. She began, then stopped, her voice caught somewhere between her chest and her throat. The magnitude of what she was hearing seemed too enormous to process. The reading program would survive. It would more than survive. It would flourish in ways she had only imagined in her most optimistic moments. Martha left the stage and walked directly to Elara, pulling her into an embrace that was both gentle and fierce. "You did this," she whispered in Elara's ear. "Your proposal, your passion, your years of dedication. This is what made it happen." Over Martha's shoulder, Elara could see the children's photographs looking back at her from the display, and suddenly she understood that this moment wasn't just about funding or programs or administrative victories. It was about Tommy's shy smile when he shared his robot book, about Maya's boundless enthusiasm for dragon stories, about Sarah's transformation from non-reader to bookworm. It was about the quiet moments when a child discovered that words on a page could transport them anywhere, could make them feel less alone, could show them possibilities they had never imagined. The evening passed in a blur of congratulations and conversations, business cards exchanged, and plans discussed. David Chen, who turned out to be the Foundation's program director, explained that Elara's proposal had been forwarded to them by a city council member who had been quietly impressed by her persistence and thoroughness. The Foundation specialized in supporting exactly the kind of grassroots initiatives that larger funders often overlooked, and Elara's detailed vision for the reading program had aligned perfectly with their mission. "We see a lot of proposals," David told her as the evening wound down. "Most of them are well-intentioned but vague, heavy on sentiment but light on specifics. Your proposal was different. You didn't just tell us what you wanted to do. You showed us exactly how you would do it, why it mattered, and what success would look like. That's rare." As the last guest departed and the volunteers began cleaning up, Elara found herself alone with her display, looking at the photographs of the children who had unknowingly become the center of an extraordinary transformation. The fairy tale nature of the evening still felt surreal, as if she might wake up tomorrow to discover it had all been an elaborate dream. Martha appeared beside her, holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the slightly exhausted but satisfied expression of someone who had just pulled off a successful surprise party. "How are you processing all of this?" she asked, handing Elara one of the cups. "I'm not sure I am yet," Elara admitted. "This morning I was worried about whether we'd have enough supplies to last through the holidays. Now I'm trying to imagine what it will be like to have dedicated space and enough resources to serve twice as many children." "You know what the best part is?" Martha said. "You earned this. Not through politics or connections or luck, but through the quality of your work and the depth of your commitment." David told me that the Foundation's board was unanimous in their decision. They said it was one of the most compelling proposals they'd received in years. That night, Elara walked home through the same streets she had traveled that morning, but everything looked different. The streetlights seemed brighter, the late autumn air felt crisp rather than cold, and the city's nighttime energy felt welcoming instead of overwhelming. She carried with her a folder of documents from the Foundation, grant agreements to review, program guidelines to study, and a letter from the Foundation's executive director expressing their excitement about partnering with the community center. In her small apartment, she spread the papers across her kitchen table and read through them slowly, savoring each detail. The funding would begin in January, allowing her the holiday season to plan and prepare for the program's expansion. There would be new books to purchase, curriculum to develop, and space to design. For the first time in years, she would be working toward growth rather than simply fighting against decline. She thought about the children who would benefit from these resources, not just Maya and Tommy and Sarah, but the dozens of other young people who would discover the reading program in the months and years to come. Children who might otherwise struggle with literacy would have access to individualized support. Kids who felt different or isolated might find refuge in stories that showed them they weren't alone. Young people who had never seen themselves as readers might discover that books could be doorways to infinite possibilities. The transformation felt profound in ways that went beyond the practical impact of additional funding. For years, Elara had carried a quiet sense of invisibility, a feeling that her contributions were too small to matter in any meaningful way. She had continued her work because she believed in its importance, but she had done so with the resigned understanding that recognition and support were luxuries she couldn't expect. Tonight had shattered that understanding completely. Her work hadn't been invisible after all, It had been seen, evaluated, and deemed worthy of substantial investment by people whose job it was to identify programs that made a real difference. The proposal she had written in her apartment on quiet evenings, fueled by nothing more than coffee and determination, had been powerful enough to convince sophisticated philanthropists that her vision was worth backing. As she prepared for bed, Elara caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror and was surprised by what she saw. The woman looking back at her still had the same quiet features and unremarkable appearance, but there was something different in her expression, a confidence she hadn't seen before, a sense of purpose that seemed to radiate from within. She was still the same person who found comfort in routine and order, who preferred books to crowds and quiet conversations to public speaking. But she was also, she realized, someone whose quiet persistence had created lasting change, whose careful attention to detail had convinced strangers to invest in her dreams, whose love for children and literature had proven powerful enough to secure the future of something she cared deeply about. The next morning, Elara woke before her alarm and lay in bed for a few minutes, allowing herself to remember the previous evening and confirm that it had actually happened. The grant documents were still on her kitchen table, the congratulatory messages were still on her phone, and the sense of possibility that had filled her the night before remained as bright as ever. She made her usual morning walk to the library, but her steps carried a different energy now. She still moved with the same purposeful efficiency, but there was a lightness in her bearing that hadn't been there before. The future stretched ahead of her, full of programs to plan and children to serve and stories to share. At the library, she went through her morning routine with the same careful attention to detail she had always brought to her work, but her mind was already racing ahead to the possibilities the grant would create. She imagined the new reading space taking shape, comfortable seating areas where children could curl up with books, technology stations where they could explore digital literacy, and shelves lined with new volumes chosen specifically to appeal to young readers. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Martha. Board meeting this afternoon to start planning the expansion. Can you join us at 4 p.m.? Elara typed back her confirmation, feeling a thrill of anticipation that was entirely new to her professional experience. For the first time in her career, she was being invited to participate in planning discussions not as a peripheral volunteer, but as the architect of something significant and successful. That afternoon, sitting around the conference table in the community center's cramped office, Elara found herself in the unexpected position of being the person everyone else looked to for guidance. The board members, local business owners, and community leaders she had always regarded as more important and influential than herself were asking for her input on timelines and program design, treating her expertise with the respect she had never quite believed she deserved. "Elara, you know these children better than anyone," said board president Mrs. Chen, a retired teacher whose grandson had participated in the reading program the previous year. "What do you think would have the biggest impact on their development?" As she began to outline her vision for expanded programming, Elara felt something shifting inside her. The words came easily now, backed by years of experience and months of careful planning, but also by a new confidence in the value of her perspective. She wasn't just the quiet librarian anymore, grateful for whatever scraps of support might come her way. She was an educator and advocate whose judgment had been validated by sophisticated funders, whose proposals had been deemed worthy of substantial investment. The meeting stretched for nearly 2 hours as they discussed everything from staffing needs to space renovation to community outreach strategies. Elara took careful notes, already mental organizing the tasks ahead into the manageable, sequential steps that would transform abstract plans into concrete reality. Walking home that evening, she passed the community center and could see the main hall through the windows, back to its usual configuration after the previous night's gala. But she could also envision how it would look in a few months, with a corner dedicated to the expanded reading program and children scattered throughout the space, absorbed in books that had been chosen specifically for their interests and reading levels. The transformation seemed to extend beyond the program itself to encompass her own sense of place in the world. She was still the woman who found peace in library stacks and preferred crossword puzzles to cocktail parties, but she was also someone whose quiet contributions had proved capable of creating lasting change. The girl who had always believed her story was barely worth telling had discovered that her narrative was compelling enough to attract the attention and investment of people whose job was to identify stories worth supporting. As winter deepened and the new year approached, Elara threw herself into the work of program development with an energy and enthusiasm that surprised even her. The grant funding had removed the constant anxiety about resources and sustainability that had shadowed her work for years, freeing her to focus on the creative and educational aspects of program design that she loved most. She spent her evenings researching curriculum development and literacy best practices, creating detailed plans for age-appropriate programming that would serve children from preschool through early adolescence. She visited other successful reading programs in neighboring communities, collecting ideas and forming relationships with educators who share her passion for youth literacy. The children, when they returned from winter break, sensed the change immediately. Maya bounced into the reading corner on the first Tuesday in January with her usual enthusiasm, but stopped short when she saw the stack of new books that had arrived over the holidays. "Miss Elara, are all of these for us?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. "They're the first installment," Elara replied, unable to suppress her smile. "There will be many more coming throughout the year, and by summer we'll have our own special reading room with comfortable chairs and good lighting and space for everyone." Tommy, emboldened perhaps by the festive atmosphere, raised his hand like they were in a classroom. "Will we still have story time?" he asked, and Elara could hear the slight worry in his voice, as if he feared that improvement might somehow mean the loss of the intimate, personal elements he valued most. "We'll always have story time," she assured him. "That's the heart of everything we do here. All the new resources and space are just ways to make our story times even better." Over the following months, as renovations began on the dedicated reading space and new program components were gradually implemented, Elara found herself inhabiting a role she had never expected, that of a recognized expert whose opinion was sought and valued by others in the field. She was invited to speak at a conference on rural literacy programs, asked to serve on a county-wide committee developing reading standards, and consulted by other community organizations looking to develop their own youth programming. The recognition felt surreal at times, especially when she found herself in situations that would have terrified her just a year earlier. But she discovered that her expertise, built through years of direct service and careful observation, gave her a confidence that transcended her natural introversion. When she spoke about literacy development or community programming, she wasn't just sharing abstract theories. She was talking about Maya's progress, Tommy's transformation, Sarah's journey from reluctant reader to voracious consumer of chapter books. The new reading space opened in May, just as the school year was winding down and summer programming was beginning. The renovation had transformed an underutilized storage area into a bright, welcoming room with large windows, comfortable seating areas, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that were gradually filling with carefully selected volumes. At the opening ceremony, attended by foundation representatives, community leaders, and dozens of families, Elara stood before a crowd that was exponentially larger than the sparse gatherings she was accustomed to addressing. But as she looked out at the faces, including Maya and Tommy and Sarah sitting in the front row with their parents, she felt not anxiety, but a deep sense of completion. "A year ago," she began, "this program served 15 children in a corner of the main hall, with donated books and volunteer enthusiasm as our primary resources. Today, we're opening a dedicated space that will serve more than 50 children annually, with programming designed to meet the individual needs of each young reader who walks through our doors." She paused, looking around the room at the evidence of what persistence and careful planning could accomplish. "But the most important thing hasn't changed at all. We're still here because we believe that every child deserves to discover the magic of reading, to find stories that speak to their experiences, and to develop the skills that will serve them throughout their lives." After the ceremony, as families explored the new space and children claimed favorite spots among the reading nooks, Martha pulled Elara aside with an expression that was both proud and slightly emotional. "Do you remember last year when you were convinced that your proposal had disappeared into some administrative black hole?" she asked. Elara nodded, recalling the months of silence that had followed her submission to various funding sources. "I want you to know that I never doubted it would find the right audience eventually. Your work was too good, too thoughtful, too clearly beneficial to go unnoticed forever. Sometimes the best ideas just need time to reach the people who are ready to support them. As the evening wound down and the last families departed, Elara found herself alone in the new reading space, surrounded by the tangible evidence of what her quiet persistence had accomplished. The comfortable chairs and well-stocked shelves were satisfying to see, but what moved her most deeply was imagining the children who would benefit from these resources, not just the current participants she knew and loved, but the future readers who would discover literature and literacy in this space over the years to come. She thought about the girl she had been at 7, the quiet child who had found refuge in library stacks and discovered that books could provide both escape and understanding. That young person could never have imagined that her love of reading would eventually create opportunities for other children to have similar experiences, that her career would involve not just consuming stories, but creating the conditions for new readers to find their own literary journeys. The journey from invisible librarian to recognized advocate had been neither dramatic nor sudden. It had been built through small, consistent actions, showing up for story time week after week, writing careful proposals that nobody seemed to read, advocating for program funding in meetings where her voice often went unheard. But those small actions had accumulated over time into something substantial and enduring, a foundation solid enough to support not just her own sense of purpose, but the educational needs of an entire community. Walking home that night through the familiar streets that had witnessed her transformation, Elara carried with her a profound sense of alignment between her deepest values and her daily work. She was still the woman who preferred quiet evenings and crossword puzzles, who found large crowds overwhelming and small talk challenging. But she was also someone whose contributions had proved significant enough to attract substantial funding, whose vision had been compelling enough to convince experienced philanthropists that her work was worth supporting. The reading program would continue to grow and evolve, serving new children and adapting to changing community needs. There would be challenges ahead, programs to develop, relationships to build, outcomes to measure and report. But for the first time in her professional life, Elara approached these challenges not with resignation or anxiety, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered that her contributions, however modest they might seem, were capable of creating lasting and meaningful change. In the months that followed, as summer programming flourished and fall enrollment exceeded all projections, Elara settled into her expanded role with the same methodical attention to detail that had always characterized her work. But there was a new dimension to her efforts now, a sense that she was building something that would endure beyond her own involvement, creating opportunities that would benefit children she might never meet. The shy librarian, who had once felt invisible in her own community, had become a quiet leader whose influence extended far beyond the reading program that had launched her transformation. She remained fundamentally the same person, thoughtful, careful, more comfortable with books than crowds, but she now carried herself with the assurance of someone who had learned that the most profound changes often happen not through dramatic gestures, but through the patient accumulation of small, meaningful actions performed with love and dedication over time. And in the reading corner where it had all began, Maya and Tommy and Sarah continued to discover new stories, their enthusiasm for literature a daily reminder that the most important victories are often the quietest ones, achieved not through headlines or recognition but through the simple act of showing up consistently for the people and causes that matter most.